CBSI Connect system is one of our main regional projects under the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, which started in 2010 and was a recognition by the CARICOM states, the Dominican Republic and the United States, that we needed a joint approach to some of the security issues that we're facing in the Caribbean. So CBSI Connect was a way to promote law enforcement information sharing across the Caribbean region.
CBSI Connect allows each institution to act independently with its own independent portal site, but also replicate credentials to a shared site where collaboration and learning can take place among all participating institutions.
Through the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, we've started several regional programs, whether that's justice sector training on ballistics investigations, or law enforcement investigations training. And through CBSI Connect, these trainings can be broadcast to all member states.
Academies, agencies have been using it. We have had an increase in enrollment of participants for courses.
The knowledge that has been gained in the field, the knowledge that has been gained in the region can be shared, and that sharing and that collaboration is what makes this a very special asset moving forward for Caribbean law enforcement.
CBSI Connect users can either view our trainings at the academies themselves that are installed conference centers, or they can even use it at their on their laptops at home. And I believe we now also have mobile capability, so it is truly a training system that's accessible anywhere.
We have regular meetings with heads of academies. We meet regularly with agencies in the region. We get their input into courses and programs that are being offered on CBSI Connect.
Trafficking in people, trafficking in drugs, trafficking in money transcends the participating institutions in the region and truly becomes regional problems. The sharing of information, shedding sunlight, sharing expertise is a very important tool in combating these issues.
We've seen several positive impacts from the availability of training on CBSI Connect. One of them, of course, is a travel cost savings, because you no longer have to spend a day traveling and buy an expensive flight to go receive a training at another academy.
The training that has been done on CBSI Connect for law enforcement officers has had tremendous response. We have had an increase in enrollment of participants on CBSI Connect. We have had academies putting more courses on CBSI Connect. We have had training every month on CBSI Connect.
We encourage the use of the system for both internal training and external training. And we are trying to build out the library of available courses stored on the system. And we encourage our member states to upload their individual training, which they want to share with the community.
If there are courses that are available that pique your interest, that could enhance your job, your ability to perform your duties as a professional over CBSI Connect, seek them out, participate, engage. This is really the value of what this technology brings to the region.
And that has allowed different academies to build much stronger ties with each other and cooperate on shared law enforcement challenges in the region.
The Right Honorable Alan Chastanet, Prime Minister of St. Lucia, and the keynote speaker for our session. Dr. David Farrell, Executive Director, Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. Mr. Barton Clark, Executive Director, Caribbean Agricultural Research and Development Institute. Dr. Colin Young, Executive Director, Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. Dr. Gary C. Jackson, Executive Director, Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Jones, Executive Director, Acting, CARICOM IMPACS. Ms. Elizabeth Riley, Executive Director, Acting, Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. Ms. Tanya Ayal, Director, Acting, CARICOM IMPACS, and our moderator for today. Virtual audience, good morning. I wish to extend a warm welcome to all to the session on climate change and security, building resilience in small island developing states. This is session 8 of our first ever virtual security conference entitled Securing Our Community Within the Era of COVID-19 and Beyond, which started on Monday, July 27th and ends tomorrow, July 31st. I am Joycelyn Hughes, Border Security Affairs Specialist at CARICOM IMPACS. CARICOM IMPACS is honored to be a part of the CBSI Connect platform since 2018 and to be partners with police training academies in the region, the regional security system, as well as the training academy in the Dominican Republic, which are all participating members on the platform. As a result of the pandemic, the CBSI Connect is the first go-to platform for facilitating law enforcement training in the region. The focus is always on learning and implementing international best practices in crime prevention and detection, criminal prosecution, and includes sessions on the holistic well-being of all law enforcement officers. There has been an exponential growth of all the users of the learning platform and a remarkable increase in the number and types of programs that are offered. Between 2018 and 2019, over 8,000 persons were trained, in which CARICOM IMPACS led trainings and facilitated over 2,000 officers. Therefore, we at CARICOM IMPACS are happy to host you on this platform and to announce that the transition has already begun for the agency to manage the CBSI Connect platform. We look forward to the coming months of transition as we not only will have the opportunity to work with the current training partners, but also with regional universities. It is now my pleasure to welcome Lieutenant Colonel Michael Jones, Executive Director, Acting CARICOM IMPACS, who will give remarks. Colonel Jones.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Today is Thursday, the penultimate day of our 5-day virtual security conference. And we have had many distinguished guests, some very lively panels and debates, and a wide range of information presented to the public over the last few days. And today will be no different. This morning's session is entitled Climate Change and Security, Building Resilience in Small Island Developing and Low-Lying Coastal States is perhaps, in my mind, one of the least explored topics in security in this region. In a debate at the Security Council in April 2007, it became clear that climate change presented consequences which had far-reaching effects on security, especially when the effects of climate change severely affects the social and economic fabric of any society and causes issues such as flooding, disease, famine, migration, etc. And you would have heard this expounded upon earlier in the week by Prime Minister Gonzalez. The Caribbean is the second most disaster-prone area in the world, and therefore taking actions to build resilience is not a choice, but a necessity. As an old teacher, I usually like to define the topic that we're talking about, and I went to the Oxford Dictionary to look for a definition of resilience, and it spoke about bouncing back or recalling from some strain or disruption. Respectfully, however, I think this definition will be limiting because it would be applied, if it's applied to the situation, we can't wait until COVID is over. We can't wait for climate change to end. The only constant in life is change, Heraclitus. So for me, if I was to put it simply, resilience is the ability to cope with the shocks and keep fighting or functioning in much the same way as we've done before. But I'm not the Messiah in this regard. My sole responsibility this morning is akin to John to herald the good news to come from our distinguished panel that we have assembled this morning, which reflects on not only the wealth of knowledge and experience which resides in the Caribbean on the topic of climate change and building resilience in the region, but its leadership as well. Please allow me to thank them for taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us today. Several of them would have to leave us early, so we really appreciate you taking the time to spend some time with us this morning and give of your knowledge. And speaking about leadership, I now have the distinct honor and privilege to introduce our keynote speaker for today, the Honorable Anu Chastity, Prime Minister of St. Lucia. Prime Minister Chastity holds the portfolio of the lead head of government on the sustainable development, which includes environment and disaster management and water. Prime Minister, sir, please accept our sincerest gratitude for being with us today. And without further delay, I yield the floor to you, sir. Please. Thank you.
Good morning, Prime Minister. We're not hearing.
He's not showing as muted, so I'm not sure if it's another problem with the machine itself.
Can you hear me?
There you go, sir.
Good morning. All right, well, thank you very much, and it's a great honor to be with you this morning. Although my team have prepared notes for me, I'm gonna maybe do what I normally do and just go off script. And really talk about the problems that climate change in particular are creating for us as small island developing states, and the impact that that's now going to have on security in the region. Sadly for us as small island developing states, the only resource that we have to try to solve our problem is through what we call is mitigation, is investing in resilience building. What we cannot do is change our lifestyles and reduce or cause the threat to be reduced. So meaning by reducing our overall emissions is not going to solve the problem. Of the 43 SIDS in the world, I think that our total contribution to carbon emissions is about 0.5%. So it just means that from a global warming perspective, we've made very little contribution to what's taking place. As that reality has set in, and we are all understanding the implications of doing nothing. So we've seen in Dominica, we've seen in Barbuda, we've seen in BVI, we saw in Puerto Rico, and sadly we got to see in Grand Bahama what happens when you don't have the resilience to withstand these kinds of hurricanes. We see the level of financial implications that it creates. So when you hear numbers like 200% of your GDP, these are unheard of numbers. And unfortunately, life goes on like it does everywhere else. And we see a Dominica coming back into operations. But what Dominica is today and what Dominica was pre those hurricanes are two very different countries. And certainly in terms of being able to attract new investment to continue to grow your destination, this has significant implications. And again, a big one really is the cost of doing business. Insurance costs are going up to where in some business operations, hotels in particular, insurance is going to exceed 20% of your operating cost. That's just an unsustainable number. And it's going to have clear implications moving forward. And so the only way to potentially reduce both the impact physically and the post-impact economically is by investing in your infrastructure. So in the case of St. Lucia, we know that rain, which causes flooding, causes landslides, are the biggest threats to our economy. And so it means that putting utility wires on the ground, larger drains, better training of our rivers, and slope stabilization, raising of bridges, the heights of bridges, all become the necessary parts of what we have to do. Now, investment in that kind of infrastructure is not going to improve the productivity of the country. So the typical type of loans that you would take to build a new road or to put optic fibers in your country to improve the efficiency of electricity, building bridges to be able to carry cars, that doesn't apply. Meaning that what we're doing is we're putting utility wires on the ground. It's not causing electricity to be more efficiently distributed. All it is an insurance. Raising the height of a bridge that carries the same number of cars it was carrying before doesn't improve the capacity of the country. And so what I mean by that is the ability to repay that investment becomes significantly more difficult. And as a result of it, what we're doing is taking on debt to GDP, but not getting the requisite return on that investment where we can now pay for that investment over a period of time. And because your debt to GDP is going up, it's now going to have an implication or impact on your credit rating. Your credit rating declining now raises the cost of borrowing money that you would traditionally borrow, and it becomes a spiral effect downwards. And so the immediate impact it's going to have on security is where an area in which we should be making significant more investments, now it comes into competition. So we know that every single year there's a hurricane season, and it's a race against time that we're involved in. And sadly, many of the countries' debt to GDP are increasing. Now, COVID has just exacerbated that problem, because in many ways, COVID has created the same problem that the climate change was creating. So what's happened with COVID is, for instance, the tax earnings of St. Lucia dropped, like many other countries, because of our dependency on tourism, by 50%. That's $50 million a month that we're short. So over 12 months on average, you're talking a drop of $600 million in revenue. You've now had an increase in cost of your budget because we've got to put in a respiratory hospital, all the PPP equipment we're bringing in, all the testing we're putting in, bringing people into a quarantine hotel that's costing us $2.5 million a month. So the cost of my budget has gone up. And then furthermore, we have bonds and treasury bills that are coming due that normally these things would just roll over automatically with very little redemption. Now we're seeing a redemption of almost 25% in the early days. And I think that if the economic crisis continues and more companies need their liquidity themselves, there's a possibility of a greater amount of redemption. So it means that the government of St. Lucia had to find almost $900 million in order to be able to pay for its budget. That is a 20% increase in my debt. So my debt to GDP, with nothing changing, has gone up by 20%. And then to make matters worse, your GDP number is dropping. So early stages was a 10% drop in GDP. That's been revised to 15%. There's been some new revisions that are suggesting that the drop in GDP could be as much as 20%. So here you are taking on more debt, as well as your GDP is going down. So St. Lucia's debt to GDP was 59% pre-COVID, and we're looking at minimum going to 85%, but there are some models that show it going past 100% in 1 year. So already CARICOM has downgraded St. Lucia from triple B to a BB minus. And they've done that not necessarily because of the debt we've taken on, but because they are concerned that the global economy is not going to return as fast as they were expecting. And as a result of that, growth and your debt to GDP are going to continue to grow. That's their biggest concern. Now, the question is, what does this all have to do with security? What does this have to do with climate change? Is that in essence, the biggest fallout that we're having from the pandemic and that we've been having with climate change is financial. And that's why what we've been attempting to do as leaders of this region is to, first of all, get the OECD to reclassify the small island developing states not using per capita GDP. So we think that per capita GDP, which is a measurement that's used that determines how much access you're going to have to concessional funds, is inadequate. So you take a Bahamas where their debt to GDP, their per capita GDP was $35,000, well, considered a very wealthy country. But in absolute terms, because the population is only 380,000 people, it's not a lot of money. And because of that, Bahamas does not have access to concessional funds. And so imagine now all of the resilience building that we're talking about, which has no impact on the capacity or the productivity of your country, they're having to borrow at commercial terms. Big problem. So what we've been arguing with the OECD is to use a vulnerability index to determine the wealth of small island developing states, because there are things which are outside of our ability to be able to affect. The second thing that we've indicated to them is that we feel that there should be a dedicated fund for the SIDS in order to be able to access concessional funds. The third thing that we've been talking about is that the governance structure around these funds needs to be streamlined in order to allow us to spend the money quicker. And this idea that even though we're in a hurricane season, we're still 9 months away from the next hurricane season. So time is against us. And we used the recent DFID program, where the British government, when Prime Minister Cameron was in office, gave 330 million pounds in grant funds. I'm hoping that St. Lucia is going to start the project in the next 2 months. 8 years to be able to get grant money implemented. It's ridiculous. So we're saying that not only do we have to have dedicated funds, but we need to look at a new governance structure in terms of how those funds are going to be implemented. And then the last one really is to say that this debt that we're incurring for building resilience should not be considered part of our debt portfolio. That this debt should be below the line. Yes, we're responsible for repaying it, and we can put models in to be able to have it repaid. But it's just a double-edged sword for us in that we're having to take on this debt, but that the debt to GDP number is now working against us. So similar to what Europe did after World War II, which was the Marshall Plan. So the justification for a lot of these different things is to say, after World War II, when the UN organization came in, when the IMF and the World Bank, and we went to the Bretton Woods monetary system, that nobody envisaged small states in the late 40s and early 50s. In fact, many of the small states came into existence later in the 60s and in the 70s, and some of them as late as early 80s, which is when the mainly UK, because 43 of the 47 SIDS are Commonwealth countries, when they gave them their independence. And certainly the systems that were set up never envisaged these kinds of small island developing states existing. So I've given you a general background as to the problems that we're having, and the economic fallout is creating the crisis now with security. So without the pandemic, it's very easy to see the problems that are being created. So if you're not able to invest in infrastructure, if every single time you have a hurricane, in essence, the capacity of the country is further deteriorated, the ability to be able to create economic activity on the ground certainly now creates the threat for crime. Our physical location So if you take St. Lucia as an example, our proximity to Martinique. So we have international flights, we have cruise ship passengers, and we have cargo. And then we're only 15 miles away from Martinique. We become a very attractive destination because we know that once the drugs get into Martinique, they're in Europe. And so they know that as well. So if in fact St. Lucia's capacity to protect its borders is deteriorating on an annual basis, then the prospect of more and more persons coming in to take advantage of that is self-evident. And then therefore you have a significantly increase in crime and the attempted policing. The pandemic now has created another problem, which is social. None of us really generally understand what the true fallout is going to be psychologically in our population of one being locked up for the period of time that they were or confined. But the bigger one, which is many people don't have the capacity to deal with the level of uncertainty that the world exists. Lost my job, just accustomed to getting my paycheck, don't know when my next paycheck is going to come in, don't have any savings, school is about to begin, don't know where I'm going to get the food. That creates a tremendous amount of anxiety in a lot of persons. So even here in St. Lucia, we've had a spate of murders, but the spate of murders have been fighting over land, domestic fights, and you know that that's really that anxiety that is really creating this boiling and tipping point in many ways. And you'll know that this is the most difficult type of crime to fight. You know, this is not criminal activity. This is just social breakdown. And so therefore, it's a much longer term strategy of retraining and helping psychologically your population. And that's really, for the most part, out of the domain of the police, but they're the ones having to deal with the mess. So that's where we are currently. The pandemic, psychologically, and clearly now financially, I think that every day that goes by, you see it for yourself on TV, the economic fallout is going to be substantially greater than what anybody has ever anticipated. And if I could just share a statistic with you, it's a very revealing number. When I was working at Air Jamaica and we had the 9/11, the airlines were really shut down globally for 12 days. That was in, remember, 2001, September. For the year 2002, the airline industry lost more money in that year than the airline industry collectively had made for its history. And that's with 12 days of shutdown. Here we are going on 6 to 8 weeks where airlines have been shut down, the world has been shut down. The losses that are being accumulated certainly are going to dictate many more businesses are going to go out of business, and there's going to be a significant restructuring that's going to take place in the world. We've not begun to feel that level of fallout. And I say this because it means that from a security perspective, there's going to be even more pressure that's being put on. So what's the big solution here? And I'm sure that you will all happy to hear this, is that the level of integration in our region needs to happen at a faster pace. The cost of governance is going to get higher. The opportunity of generating revenue is going to become less. And so the only way to solve this problem in my mind is a significant improvement in integration and also the use of technology. So we're seeing e-platforms around the world growing in implementation at a faster rate. So I've certainly been on the record, and I will continue to say that. I think that there needs to be a stronger regional force. I was not happy with the report that came out where we talked about having a smaller force. I think that we should have and I'm sorry using my American comparison, but whether it's an M5 or an FBI operation for CARICOM, that's a standing police force, that the ability of the best officers from around the region being able to work in this entity, the entity being able to come in and help strengthen. And the fact is that it's monitoring the region because crime is no longer domestic. no longer just one island. It is all of us collectively. And certainly the economic challenges that we're going to have, the social challenges we're going to have, in my humble opinion, really require us to step up our game and create a singular database. I mean, yesterday was a very interesting discussion with the cruise industry because the cruise itinerary is literally going to have to become one destination. So in essence, a bubble. So whatever port of calls they're going to go into, each country needs to sign off on what those protocols, and being satisfied that the passengers that are going to get off in Dominica, when they come to St. Lucia, that they're safe, or if they come to Barbados, that they're safe. But even the idea of APIS, did APIS exist? So passengers that were getting on board in Miami or getting on board in Puerto Rico, when they came into our region, were that's manifest being shared, and therefore did we know that they were in the region? So we're even moving to a more integrated e-platform to get persons to register, send their electronic certificates, and also monitoring where they're going. So even creating a financial app on it so that as passengers get off on each destinations, we actually can track where they've been. This is certainly going to help, I think, significantly with the policing in the region. It was, I think, a hole that existed that we can hopefully close. And certainly the last one I just want to say to you is clearly technology is required. The ability of a broader police or security force to be in place and more involved in what is taking place in our countries is absolutely necessary. And I certainly have been and will continue to be a supporter and advocate of $1 of the airport tax going towards paying for this security force. But if we allow this to not be strengthened at this particular time, the need for was the economic fallout from the pandemic and also the economic fallout from climate change are certainly going to require us to do this, because it cannot be business as usual. You're not going to have the resources on a national basis. And the only way to improve the efficiency is on a shared basis. And certainly the effectiveness of a police force that's regional in scope, in my humble opinion, is going to be much, much better. So I'm hoping that I'm able to give you a good insight in terms of where we are and what we're attempting to do to battle this crisis. This is could potentially cause the economic demise of our region. I can tell you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. To say it as food for thought would be a understatement. And I really appreciate how they consolidated all of the issues and show how they want impact upon each other. And I certainly also want to thank you, not for taking the time out of your schedule to be with us today, but certainly for your steadfast commitment in all of the pledges that you've made so far, the consistency as it relates to the funding of the regional entities by the term that was being used by some heads, the automaticity of funding. That is something you've always been resolute in that regard. Like I said, I like the juxtaposition of things. One word that was missing out of the history and economic and politics lesson that you gave just now would be the whole issue of reparations, which I know can be a contentious issue. But certainly when we look at the history, like I said, you show the connection between the 43 or the 47 SIDS being part of the British Commonwealth. It's certainly food for thought and something that could be explored. But they're not here to hear me. There's a distinguished panel, so I will shut up now and over to Tanya for moderating today's proceedings. Over to you, T. Thanks again, sir.
Thank you, Honorable Prime Minister, and thank you, Executive Director Jones. Honorable Prime Minister, to say that you have set the tone is an understatement. So for me, you've made my job easier. I don't need to set any further context. I will simply now introduce the panel. And today I have the honor of moderating a panel with not only you present, Honorable Prime Minister, but with six executive directors present. Today we have Dr. David Farrell, who is the principal, Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. Dr. Farrell has been the principal since 2006 and has significant experience in the areas of hydrogeology and applied geophysics. He sits on a number of technical advisory committees for regional disaster management and climate change projects. We also have Dr. Colin Young, who was appointed the Executive Director of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, and we fondly call that the 5 Cs in the region. Dr. Young has a PhD in ecology, and prior to his appointment, he served as the Chief Executive Officer of the Belize Social Security Board, and he has an extensive public service record, serving as the Chief Executive Officer in the Ministry of Energy, Science and Technology and Public Utilities in Belize, as well as in the Ministry of Forestry and Fisheries and Sustainable Development, and as the chairman of the Protected Areas Conservation Trust, also in Belize. I also have the distinct pleasure of introducing Ms. Elizabeth Riley, and she was appointed the Acting Executive Director at the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, effective 1st of May 2020. Ms. Riley has over 20 years experience in the area of disaster management at the regional and international levels in various capacities. She has written, presented, and published several technical papers in disaster management and environmental management. Ms. Riley has also lectured in disaster management at the University of West Indies, Cave Hill and Mona campuses in Barbados and Jamaica, respectively. Mr. Barton Clark. He was appointed the Executive Director of the Caribbean Agricultural Research and Development Institute on 12 May 2015. Mr. Clark has significant experience in the area of agriculture and has served as Chief Agricultural Officer in his native Barbados. He was previously the Food and Agriculture, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations representative for Trinidad and Tobago and Suriname at the FAO office in Trinidad and Tobago. And last but no means least, we have Dr. Gary Jackson, who was appointed in 2018 as the Executive Director of the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, CCRE. Dr. Jackson leads the implementation of CCRE's 3 main priorities, and these are creating an expert knowledge base, optimizing technological solutions through tool development, and transforming the region by utilizing sustainable energy as a means to advance the well-being of at-risk and vulnerable groups. The extensive bios will be posted on our website, www.CARICOMImpacts.org/CONF 2020. We could not ask for better representation today, and I think the Honorable Prime Minister's opening speech has really set the tone for this panel. So without further delay, I will now ask Dr. Farrell to lead off the presentations. Dr. Farrell, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Hearing you loud and clear, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'd first like to acknowledge the presence of the Right Honorable Prime Minister St. Lucia, Mr. Alain Chastanet, and fellow panelists. I'd like to thank CARICOM IMPACS for the invitation to participate in this discussion. As the moderator has pointed out, I am the principal of the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, which is the technical organ of the Caribbean Meteorological Organization. And the CIMH is also an institution of the Caribbean community, CARICOM. Some of you may know CIMH in its former name as the Caribbean Meteorological Institute. There are 16 member states of the CIMH. And I'm not going to go through them, but they're all primarily the old British colonies in the region, with the exception of the Bahamas. Interestingly enough, earlier this morning, I was also in a conference call, and the discussion was about COVID, and it's WMO's task force to look at COVID and to see what types of products and services WMO and its community can provide to the global response to COVID-19. And so the weather and climate community is actively engaging in addressing this particular problem. It is increasingly recognized that extreme weather and climate lead to varying levels and forms of insecurity at regional, national, and community levels. And as a result, building climate resilience is essential to minimizing all levels of climate-related insecurity across the region. I don't think that is a surprise to anyone. The challenge here, in part, is the whole issue of climate change and building what it means to build resilience to climate change. One is, to build resilience, we must be able to predict what the climate is going to do at short terms and at long terms, and to look at how these impacts, or climate-related impacts, impact the social and economic development of the region. Based on, as the Prime Minister has pointed out, these impacts lead to different types of insecurity, but also to civil unrest and concerns. So one of the challenges that we have now is looking at not just the whole issue of climate and security, but looking at how that is impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll leave a lot of the discussion to the panel, the group discussion phase, but I'll just talk briefly about how CIMH is contributing to the whole issue of climate change and building resilience in the region. So first, capacity development. The CIMH builds regional capacity within the National Meteorological and Hydrological Services, and therefore is an essential cog in the hydrometeorological and climatological observation and early warning systems. This is important as we look to build resilience, getting the right information to the right people with regards to weather and climate. Research and development. We're focused on better understanding the hydrometeorological and climate systems across the Caribbean, including a better understanding of weather and climate systems and their drivers. And by extension, how does weather and climate transition into the productive sectors within the region? We're also the regional climate data center. We're focused on collecting, quality assuring, archiving, and disseminating the region's climate data to various stakeholders, including national governments, global databases, and academia that serve to better understand climate change and variability at varying scales across the region. And here I make the point that we can talk about two things. When we talk about climate, we can talk about long-term climate change, but we also have to factor in variability, which is what happens from season to season. We all know that there's a summer, we all know that there's a winter, but not every summer and every winter are all the same, and this defines the variability. The next thing that we do is we develop and deliver regional climate services. This is new as part of the global framework for climate services, but one of the things that we're actively involved in is building climate products and services at seasonal scales and sub-seasonal scales, as well as longer timeframes, to provide critical information to productive sectors, especially those productive sectors that are sensitive to climate. We can talk in this case about the energy sector, the water sector, the food, agriculture and food security, disaster risk reduction, the health sector, water sector, and the tourism sectors. And we've been working over the last decade to build products and services for these sectors. These are delivered through climate outlook forums at the regional level, as well as national partnerships and the regional institutional consortia. And here I talk about the UESAC's Partner Consortium, which several of the, in fact, all of the panelists here are involved in working towards, where we take climate information and integrate it into productive sectors. We're also involved in weather and climate prediction through the Caribbean Center for Environmental Simulations, where we've used computational platforms to provide high-resolution numerical weather prediction products and climate products. As I pointed out, we talk about UESACs and CARICOM. CARICOM brings together the weather and climate community to provide a climate outlook for the next 6-month periods. There are 2 CARICOM forecasting periods, the wet season and the dry season. And so we usually have about 60 to 80 persons from around the region participate in the CARICOM process, and that information feeds into their planning activities for the next 6-month period. There are now quite a number of these national outlook forums developing as well. And participants in the CARICOM process obviously come from the productive sectors around the region who are sensitive to climate information. We also have the Caribbean Early Warning Information systems across climate timescales, UESAC's consortium, again, which many people in this panel participate. And one of the things that we do is we try to get co-development, co-delivery of climate products and services for each sector to make sure that the sectors have the information that they need for planning and so on. But one of the things that we have not been spending a lot of time on, although we have discussed it, is really how to bring the security system into play within the UESACs and CARICOM processes. It is clear that the security, that early warning information products for the security system in the region can play a major role in helping the security systems plan their activities from season to season. It is interesting that the Prime Minister Chastanet pointed out that one of the challenges is, for example, drug smuggling. Are there certain types of climates that facilitate the production of certain types of products, drug-related products and services? Can we help the security systems identify these periods for when certain activities, nefarious activities, may be more prevalent? These are things that we can work with the security community to look at and to help train the next generation of security officers with regards to being able to utilize climate information to support their activities. And finally, I would just say that the CIMH is actively working with the health sector and the disaster management sector on addressing the issue of COVID-19 within the region through the provision of products and information to the 2 sectors. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Farrell. And that certainly brings us to the point where we have some other questions, but we'll wait until the panel discussion. I'd like to now move to Dr. Young from the 5Cs. Dr. Young.
Good morning. And I want to acknowledge the Right Honorable Prime Minister from St. Lucia, the other distinguished colleagues on the panel, and Mr. Jones from CARICOM IMPACS. I also want to thank CARICOM IMPACS for putting together such a wonderful and timely, relevant conference and using technology, as the Prime Minister mentioned, to be able to deliver to a large audience what is a very, very important topic. The 5Cs is located in Belize and was established by the heads of government to essentially lead and coordinate the Caribbean's response to climate change. And we do that through strong partnerships with regional organizations, many, in fact, all of the institutions on the panel today, as well as by serving as an implementing entity to channel climate finance into the region to fund climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. And in fact, since establishment, the center has leveraged and mobilized over $260 million into the region for projects from regional public goods into adaptation projects within member states. But today for this panel, I want to focus really on how regional governments can align the priorities of climate action and climate ambition with the principles of the Paris Agreement and the COVID-19 recovery. I do think that there's a tremendous amount of opportunities that exist because of the disaster that we're experiencing, and learning how to harness these opportunities, I think, is a key part of building resilience going forward. The first thing I want to focus on to set the context, and the Prime Minister did such a fantastic job in touching on a couple of the points I'll raise, but the first point I want to share is, I think it's very instructive if we look at the similarities and the differences between the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. And once we understand those differences, how we use those to build our resiliency plan in SIDS, I think is very useful. And so very quickly, in terms of the similarities, obviously they're both physical shocks that are unleashing devastation on our lives and livelihoods and the way of life of our people and our economy. Both of them are taxing and stressing the region's capacity to adequately and effectively respond. Both are regressive in that they are disproportionately impacting the most vulnerable people within our societies. They're exposing the social and economic vulnerabilities that exist within our countries. And they both demonstrate the staggering costs that are associated with disasters when we don't have resiliency plans in place to deal with them. And of course, they both present security risk. On the differences side, obviously the pandemic they're imminent, they're generally discrete, and the dangers are obvious. Climate change impacts, on the other hand, are gradual, they're cumulative, it's often distributed, and people experience the impact from climate change at a differently over long periods of time. Pandemics, they require immediate action, immediate access to funding, and generally, if those interventions are proportional, we see results in relatively short period of time. Climate change, on the other hand, the interventions are required today, but the benefits really come in the future. And so we have this tragedy of the horizon issue, and oftentimes the interventions made today from the public sector side spans political terms, and sometimes will take decades for us to realize. And so sometimes the political will to do some of the urgent interventions now is difficult to rationalize considering all of the pressing circumstances that are faced within our countries. And then lastly, in terms of the differences, the pandemics represent contagion risk, while climate change has these accumulation risks where things can be uncorrelated, but you could have these positive feedback loops where impacts increase over time. And then this one goes without saying, you can't isolate and social distance from climate change, even though you can do that with pandemics. And so understanding the differences and similarities is useful to set the context of why is it that we need to build our resiliency systems and plans to be able to simultaneously take account of gradual impacts like from climate change and short-term devastating impacts like what we're seeing from the pandemics. So how do we then align climate priorities with COVID-19 recovery? I propose there are 5 ways that regional governments can approach this, 4 ways. The first is that I think governments must take comprehensive assessments geared towards identifying the strengths and weaknesses, vulnerabilities in our resilience plans that were exposed by COVID. We generally have a good sense of those issues as it relates to the climate change space, because we're pummeled every year by hurricanes or droughts or floods, sea level rise and erosion, all of the impacts that we know very well from climate change. But we're not as experienced in dealing with something like a COVID-19. And as a result, this has exposed some systemic gaps in our resilience planning that we need to understand, and we need to factor that into our planning. That assessment must also capture the innovations and the components that prove resilient during the pandemic and are still resilient today. This has to be a data-driven approach that is evidence-based, and then it should be incorporated into the climate resilient growth agenda. The second thing regional governments ought to, in my view, pursue is to look at using the data that exists both from climate change in terms of impacts and in terms of things like the pandemic, to urgently articulate a comprehensive disaster resilience strategy. And we can do this using grant funds from places like the Green Climate Fund, the Caribbean Development Bank, and technical assistance from the IMF and World Bank and others who can provide non-reimbursable financing to conduct the disaster resilience strategy. Once there's this strategy, it should be embedded within the National Sustainable Development and Climate Agenda. And a key component of the DRS is the incorporation of the nationally determined contributions that are being revised right now by member states and updated to include gaps that were exposed in the pandemic. So a lot of the NDCs are geared towards climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, largely from a climate risk point of view. We now need to look at these NDCs and see where they integrate with the COVID-19 gaps that in terms of resiliency, and then we have to merge those together. And so the disaster resilience strategy will address the short-term discrete risk, like pandemics and from hurricanes, as well as the gradual long-term climate risks such as sea level rise and droughts, erosion, and so on. Key to this disaster resilience strategy is that it has to focus on building appropriate structural, financial, and social resilience in each of our member states. And so while we have, for example, lots of experience in infrastructure investments to dealing with things like hurricane and floods, COVID-19 has exposed that there are other infrastructure that are absolutely key for us to be able to respond and ensure that they're resilient in the COVID-19 era. Things, for example, like transportation, security arrangements, energy supply chain infrastructure, food storage, healthcare, having broadband infrastructure and connectivity that can facilitate the kinds of conference we're having now and communications with the population. We have to look at these infrastructure and ensure that we could fund them to make us more resilient. So what is really the benefit of this disaster resilience strategy? What it will do if it's properly done, where it looks at the structural, the financial, and the post-recovery resilience, is that it provides a concise, clear, and coordinated envelope of resilience needs that countries can then showcase to donors, to the IFIs and development partners. The third thing that I posit that regional governments ought to look at is, since we will now have a DRS, a disaster resilience strategy, governments can then channel domestic and international resources to fund the implementation of the strategy, as well as to improve resilience in key areas like health, agriculture, water, energy, broadband connectivity, food security, border security, to name a few. The center is in Belize, and recently we have done an extremely good job in terms of flattening the curve as it relates to COVID-19. But interestingly, the largest number of cases in Belize have arisen because of what the so-called border jumpers. These are people, unlike some of the island states in the region, Belize is contiguous with Mexico to the north and west, and Guatemala to the west and south. And so there is a large number of persons that are coming across the border, and both of those countries have increasing numbers of COVID-19 cases. So there's a temptation that I think must be resisted to try to pursue short-term strategies that may, in the long run, undermine the building of resilience. The fourth area I